I was sitting alone in the living room when the evening light thinned into a pale, tired gold. Nothing was playing, nothing was waiting, and the silence felt earned, the way it does after years of learning how to survive it. Grief had settled into my life the way dust settles on furniture you no longer move. It wasn't sharp anymore or loud, it was permanent, a weight I carried without speaking its name. The house knew me well, every creak and shadow familiar, every hour arriving exactly as expected. When the phone rang, the sound felt wrong, too sharp for a place that had learned to stay quiet. I remember staring at it as if it had made a mistake simply by daring to interrupt me. Then I saw the name on the screen, the one I never erased, because erasing it felt like a second burial. My hands went numb, my breath shortened, and hope never arrived, only disbelief heavy enough to hurt. I answered because not answering felt worse, because curiosity can be cruel when grief has grown old. There was no voice, just breathing on the other end, unsteady and unmistakably human. I stood there holding the phone like a fragile thing, afraid any movement might shatter the moment. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to hear answered. I only knew that the past I trusted had just shifted, and it was already pulling me backward. Again now. I was 46 when my life narrowed into something smaller and quieter, and I learned how to live inside that reduced space. By then, I had already been alone for years, a widow in everything but paperwork, surviving on a modest pension and the careful habits of someone who learned early not to expect much. My days were simple, measured by routine rather than ambition. I cooked for one, spoke to neighbors politely, and kept my world small enough that grief could not surprise me anymore. My son had been 17 when the world still felt wide. He was not extraordinary in the way stories like to remember the DEA. He was stubborn about small things, forgetful with bigger ones, and gentle in ways he never announced. He liked his shoes worn and his opinions half-formed, changing them often without apology. He laughed quietly, the kind of laugh you missed if you weren't listening closely, and he had a habit of lingering in doorways as if he was never fully ready to leave or stay. Our relationship lived in the ordinary. Morning tea before school, shared silence in the evenings, a knock on my door before he slept. We did not speak easily about feelings, but we trusted each other with space, and that felt like love. I knew his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of his key, the way he avoided eye contact when he was hiding worry. Nothing about us was dramatic, but it was steady, and I thought that steadiness would last. The day he died arrived without warning and without ceremony. There was an accident, they said. Words delivered with practiced softness, explanations shaped to prevent questions. I remember sitting where I was told to sit, listening where I was told to listen, nodding when it seemed expected. Everything moved quickly, as if speed itself was a form of mercy. I signed papers I did not read and accepted conclusions I did not understand. The funeral passed in a blur of faces and sympathy. The casket was closed, and I was told it was better that way. People spoke about strength as if it were something I could choose, and I let them believe I had. I thanked them, received their embraces, and stood very still so I would not collapse into something I could not recover from. Afterward, life divided itself cleanly into before and after. I did not heal, I adapted. I learned how to breathe again, how to wake up without expecting his footsteps, how to sit through evenings without waiting for the sound of his voice. I never questioned what I was told, because questioning felt dangerous, like pulling at a wound that had barely stopped bleeding. When you bury a child, you don't ask for explanations. You just learn how to breathe again. For 20 years, that belief kept me upright, even as it quietly prepared me to fall. I told myself that acceptance was the same as peace, and for a long time that seemed true enough. The memories dulled, the sharp edges rounded, and grief became something I carried rather than something that carried me. I stopped imagining alternate endings, stopped wondering about unanswered details, stopped myself whenever curiosity crept too close. Certainty, even painful certainty, felt safer than doubt. It allowed me to survive without unraveling. But certainty is fragile, and it depends entirely on trust. I did not yet know how easily that trust could be shaken, or how quickly a settled past could begin to ask questions I had spent decades avoiding. At last. Slowly. The line went dead without warning. One moment there was breathing, uneven and undeniably real, and the next there was nothing but the hollow tone that signals an ending too abrupt to explain. I stayed where I was, phone pressed to my ear long after it had gone silent, as if holding it there might reverse what had just happened. When I finally lowered my hand, the room felt altered, thinner somehow, as if something invisible had passed through and left a draft behind. That night, sleep refused me completely. I lay awake questioning everything except the one thing I was most afraid to question myself. I blamed technology first, then coincidence, then the imagination of a woman who had lived too long with grief. I told myself it was a delayed echo, some trick of memory finally turning against me. Yet no explanation settled properly. Each one slid away, leaving the same uneasy truth behind: the sound I heard had not belonged to a machine. By morning, the calm I had worked so hard to build was gone, replaced by a careful, trembling focus. I checked my phone records with the detached precision of someone afraid to feel too much. The call was there, time-stamped. And unambiguous, a single entry that refused to disappear no matter how many times I refreshed the screen. It had come from his number. The one I had kept for 20 years without reason, without expectation. Seeing it listed so plainly felt worse than the call itself, because it stripped away the last excuse I had been clinging to. I tried to call back. Once. Then again. Each attempt ended the same way, an unreachable tone that offered no comfort and no answers. I stopped after the third try, my hand shaking slightly, my heart doing something unfamiliar. It was not hope exactly. Hope felt too disloyal, too dangerous. What stirred inside me was conflict, sharp and disorienting, pulling me in opposite directions. One side begged me to believe, to open a door I had sealed long ago. The other demanded loyalty to the truth I had accepted for 20 years, the truth that had allowed me to survive. I told no one. Not my sister, not my neighbor, not even the friend who checked on me out of habit. I could already hear the concern in their voices, see the careful looks that would follow. I had no desire to be pitied or gently corrected, no patience for explanations about grief resurfacing. Keeping silent felt safer, as if speaking would make the uncertainty real in a way I could not undo. As the day stretched on, memories began to surface without permission. Small details I had ignored or dismissed at the time returned with unsettling clarity. How quickly everything had happened, how decisions were made around me instead of with me. How little I was allowed to see, how often I was told it was better not to ask. I remembered the firm hands guiding me away from closed doors, the gentle insistence that rest was more important than answers. I remembered being praised for my composure, urged to move on, reminded repeatedly that dwelling would only cause pain. At the time, I had believed them. I had needed to believe them. Questioning felt like betrayal, not only of the dead but of the fragile balance I was struggling to maintain. Yet now, with that call lingering in my chest like an unanswered knock, the past no longer felt as settled as I had convinced myself it was. I began to realize how much of that day I had accepted simply because I was told to. The realization did not arrive loudly. There was no surge of anger or dramatic resolve. Instead, something quieter took hold, something steady and unfamiliar. Doubt, once introduced, refused to be silenced, and beneath it grew a careful determination. I did not know what I was looking for yet, or where it might lead. I only knew that the certainty I had trusted for 2 decades had cracked, and through that crack, questions were beginning to breathe. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to listen. I began quietly, almost apologetically, as if the past itself might hear me and object. I told myself I was only looking for reassurance, something small that would restore the order I had lived by for 20 years. Instead, I found myself returning to places I had avoided on purpose, places grief had warned me never to revisit. The hospital came first. Its corridors were narrower than I remembered, the paint duller, the air heavy with disinfectant and indifference. Names on office doors had changed, and those who remembered that day were gone, retired, or conveniently unreachable. At the police station, I was met with polite confusion. Files were requested, then delayed, then declared incomplete. A clerk explained that records from that period were archived elsewhere, misfiled, or lost during a transition no one could fully explain. Every answer arrived softened, shaped to discourage follow-up. I nodded, thanked them, and walked out into the rain feeling as though I had been dismissed again, just as gently as before. The cemetery was worse. I stood in front of the headstone I had visited for years, tracing letters that suddenly felt uncertain beneath my fingers. The ground was solely D, the marker unquestioned, yet something about it no longer held weight. I remembered how quickly it had all been arranged, how little I had been asked. Standing there, soaked and shivering, I wondered for the first time whether grief had made me obedient when I should have been curious. I requested copies of reports, medical notes, anything that might anchor me to fact. What arrived were fragments. Pages missing, signatures blurred, dates that didn't quite align. One form listed a middle name my son never used. Another recorded a time that conflicted with what I remembered being told. Alone at my kitchen table, surrounded by papers that smelled faintly of dust and age, I felt something shift. These were not dramatic revelations, just quiet inconsistencies, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The deeper I went, the heavier the conflict became. Guilt followed every question, whispering that I was betraying the version of events that had allowed me to survive. Doubt felt disloyal, almost cruel, as if reopening the past might undo the fragile peace I had earned. Yet alongside that guilt grew an obligation I could not silence. If something had been hidden from me, intentionally or not, then accepting ignorance no longer felt noble. It felt wrong. I began to consider possibilities I had once dismissed as unthinkable. Misidentification. Administrative error. A child injured and removed from sight before anyone thought to question it. The idea that my son might not have died did not arrive with hope, but with a cold, steady clarity. It explained too much to be ignored. It explained the rush, the closed casket, the urgency to move on. Late one evening, as rain traced slow lines down the window, my phone vibrated again. I did not rush this time. When I answered, there was no voice, only distant sounds layered together, traffic perhaps, or a television murmuring somewhere far away. It lasted only seconds before the line went silent. I stood there listening to nothing, my reflection staring back at me, older and suddenly alert in a way I had not been for years. In that moment, something settled firmly inside me. I understood that this search was no longer about comfort or longing. It was not about reclaiming what might have been. I wasn't chasing hope anymore. I was chasing the truth I was denied. Whatever waited ahead would demand answers, and I knew now that avoiding them was no longer an option. The path I had stepped onto led forward, whether I was ready or not. I was asked to wait in a small office on the third floor, the kind of room designed to discourage expectation. The walls were bare, the chairs uncomfortable, and the clock louder than it needed to be. When the official finally entered, he carried a thin folder and an expression that suggested practice, not surprise. He introduced himself carefully, choosing his words as though they might bruise if handled too roughly, and invited me to sit though I was already seated. He did not begin with answers. Instead, he confirmed my name, my son's name, the date I had memorized long ago. Each confirmation tightened something inside my chest. Then he paused, fingers resting on the folder, and told me there had been an error. Not a single mistake, but a sequence of them, compounded by urgency and convenience. The boy involved in the incident had survived longer than recorded. Identification was rushed. Records were filed before certainty arrived. My son, he said, had been alive when decisions were made without me. Injured, disoriented, transferred. Under the wrong name, placed into care when no family could be immediately confirmed. By the time questions surfaced, files had already been sealed, responsibilities shifted, and accountability dissolved into procedure. No one intended harm, he explained, and yet harm had been done all the same. I listened without interruption, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The room felt very still, as if even the air understood the weight of what was being spoken. When he told me my son had grown up elsewhere, unaware of who he was or where he came from, I felt no rush of joy. There was only a deep, hollow clarity. 20 years had passed while my child lived a life without me, and I had mourned someone who had been breathing somewhere beyond my reach. The phone calls, he confirmed, had come from him. Recently, through a routine review and a name discovered on an old document, my son had begun searching. Finding my number had taken weeks. Calling it had taken courage. Hearing that, I closed my eyes briefly, not to escape, but to steady myself against the sudden understanding of what those silent calls had cost him. The official apologized then, a practiced apology shaped by policy and regret. He spoke of investigations, of lessons learned, of changes implemented long after they mattered. His words were careful and sincere, but they could not restore what had been taken. He could not return the years, the birthdays missed, the ordinary days that build a life together. He could only acknowledge them. Before I left, he offered proof. Not documents or photographs, but a detail drawn from an intake note, something the boy had repeated often as a child. He had spoken about the way his mother stirred her tea counterclockwise, tapping the spoon twice against the cup before setting it down. He remembered waiting for that sound each morning. At that, my breath finally broke. I thanked the man, stood slowly, and carried the truth with me into the corridor, where grief changed shape and followed me onward. I realized then that revelation does not arrive like relief. It arrives like weight, pressing down until you must adjust the way you stand. I felt it settle into me as I asked the questions I had rehearsed in silence. Where had he been sent? Who had raised him? Whether he had been loved or merely managed. The answers were partial, constrained by law and time, and yet they were enough to redraw the map of my grief. There would be no dramatic reunion today, no running toward each other across a polished floor. What existed instead was understanding, fragile and immense. I understood why the past had always felt unfinished, why certainty had required such effort to maintain. I understood that loss can be manufactured by systems as easily as by fate. When I finally stood to leave, my legs felt unsteady, but my mind was clear. The truth had been spoken aloud, and it would demand reckoning, patiently, from this moment forward. Outside the office, the hallway stretched longer than before, each step carrying me away from the woman I had been. I thought of the child I buried and the man who had lived, both belonging to me in different ways. Nothing about the truth was kind, but it was complete, and completeness mattered. As the elevator doors closed, I felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar, not hope, not anger, but readiness. What came next would be difficult, but it would be real. I carried that readiness with me, knowing that understanding had replaced illusion, and that grief, reshaped by truth, was preparing me for the reckoning ahead. Nothing would ever be simple again. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after the building had emptied, the truth resting in front of me like an object with weight. There was no rush of anger, no dramatic collapse, no moment that fit the stories people expect. Rage never came. What arrived instead was exhaustion, deep and settling, followed by a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. I made tea out of habit and watched the steam rise, noticing how steady my hands were, how practiced grief had made me at surviving impossible things. When the phone rang again, I answered without hesitation. This time there was a voice, cautious and low, carrying a pause between words that told me he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. We spoke slowly, as if any sudden movement might break what little ground had formed between us. He did not call me mother, and I did not call him son. We used names instead, careful and respectful, acknowledging the distance without pretending it wasn't there. Our conversation was not filled with explanations. There were no accusations to trade or apologies to demand. We spoke about weather, about where he lived now, about the work he did with his hands. He told me what he remembered and what he did not. I told him the same. Between us lay 20 years of absence, neither of us responsible, both of us changed by it. We named the time that had been taken without trying to reclaim it. When the call ended, I felt strangely calm. Grief had shaped me into someone strong, but it had also closed me off, teaching me to endure rather than reach. I saw that now with uncomfortable clarity. Strength had kept me upright, but it had also kept me distant, cautious, protected from disappointment. Knowing the truth did not undo that, yet it softened something I had kept rigid for too long. There was no audience for this moment, no witnesses to measure its importance. The truth arrived quietly, without spectacle or vindication, and that felt right. Some things are not meant to be dramatic. They are meant to be born, considered, and slowly understood. As I sat there, the evening settling around me, I felt the shift from shock toward meaning. The past had spoken, and I had listened. What mattered now was not what had been lost, but how I would carry what had been found forward, into the long work of living differently. I thought about the woman I had become in the years after the funeral, efficient, polite, composed, and how much of that composure had been armor. Truth did not strip it away, but it loosened its grip. It allowed me to imagine connection without guarantees, patience without certainty. Sitting there, I understood that healing was not a sudden gift. It was a decision repeated quietly, beginning now, shaped by honesty, and carried forward without urgency or fear. I stayed seated, breathing, letting understanding settle before taking next step. Months passed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each day measured not by milestones but by small, steady choices. I began to speak with him more often, not rushing, not expecting sudden intimacy. Our interactions were cautious, deliberate, built on honesty and presence rather than the illusions of the past. There was no fairy tale reunion, no instant repair of decades lost. Instead, there was patience, listening, and the quiet acknowledgement that connection could be rebuilt slowly, brick by careful brick. I forgave myself for not asking the questions I might have, for accepting explanations without protest, for letting the years slip by unchallenged. Grief, I realized, is cunning. It silences the instincts that might demand truth, especially when those instincts threaten to upend the fragile peace we cling to. Learning to forgive oneself became part of the process, as essential as speaking to him, as essential as hearing his voice. In these months, I observed how truth reshapes understanding without erasing pain. Love does not vanish simply because years were stolen, nor does absence erase the bond of blood and memory. What matters is recognition, acknowledgement, and the willingness to live honestly with what has occurred. The past remains unchangeable, but it can inform the present, granting perspective, patience, and cautious hope. I carried this insight with me into ordinary days, in the way I stirred my tea, walked past familiar streets, and listened to the quiet at night. Understanding settled into me, not as a triumph, but as a form of peace earned through endurance. When I finally reflected on the journey, I felt a subtle relief, a completion I had not anticipated. I buried my son once. But the day I learned the truth, I finally laid my grief to rest.